And it's one that has to do with a version of a talk I've given over the years on a topic I care a lot about, and that is how you manage stress at the school. And Meme was in the back and really made me feel great. She said, "Oh, I know, you're going to tell us to get sleep and eat well and all that." So thank you, Meme, for the encouragement. No, I want to talk about this. Actually, I want to give you some research and in a way that I hope is empowering and instructive for you and teaches you some truths about stress and about managing it. I know it comes with peril. When I said this to a student on Saturday, the student said, "Oh, great." But to get at the issue, and my main point and the takeaway I'd want for you is a really simple one, and it's this, and that is that stress itself is not inherently bad. Right? Stress is not inherently bad, that you have agency to manage it, and actually you can gain from it. And the way we might learn that or think about it is to start with a study that was done on some rats. This perhaps fitting since we all feel we're in a rat race, and it's a study that I learned about from a really interesting UPenn professor, a woman I know named Angela Duckworth. She's a terrific leader in this field, someone I've gotten to know well, and she's come and spoken at Taft. And here's what the study was. It was done by a psychologist named Steve Meyer. And for many years, he's done deep and leading work into the effect of stressors have on brain chemistry. Or I'm going to quote Duckworth on his work, where she says, he's looked at the degree of behavioral control organisms can exert over stressors, which is a fancy way of saying the question of whether we can do anything about the fact that we feel under adversity and stress. And here's what he did. Meyer took two groups of rats, and he gave them mild electric shocks. These are mild. This is the kind of shock you feel if you rub your feet on the carpet and touch a doorknob. The first group could turn off the shock if they turned a little wheel. So the rat is in a box and there's a little wheel. And rats, of course, are highly intelligent. And they could turn that shock off if they turned that little wheel. The second group had no wheel. Okay? And he did the experiment with rats that were 5 weeks old, which in the life of a rat is really a teenage rat. And crucially, and something no one had done before, is he repeated the experiment five weeks later when the rat, if you will, was an adult. And here's what he discovered. The adolescent rats, these 5-week rats who experienced the stress that they could not control, that is, the ones without a wheel, behaved very timidly when they were given that mild shock later. In other words, they crouched there. They just sat there waiting to be shocked. And so when they had become grown-up rats, they seemed utterly helpless when they faced stress. But the other rats, the ones who had learned how to turn a wheel, even though they were placed in a box that didn't have a wheel, they were incredibly adventurous. They were looking for solutions. There was something absolutely active about them. And they were, as she put it, as Duckworth put it, somehow inoculated against the learned helplessness of other rats. So Meyer was onto something really important. Somehow that second group of rats was wired differently and obviously wired better. Now it's a really interesting experiment, and it tells us something important, and it's not really just the same as a grumpy grandfather telling you about how tough life was when he was young and how strong he is now, true as that might be. Meyer has done very deep and robust work. It's highly respected. His research is on brain circuits and structures and neurotransmitter. It's on what Duckworth has called the neurobiology of hope. And he's exploring how our brain circuitry when we are young, in particular your age, is plastic. It's not fixed. It can be changed. The circuitry, the wiring can actually be changed and develop over the course of our life. And his experiment had the simple genius because it did this 5-week test and then the 5-week test later. And it shed powerful light on how adolescence is a training ground for what we might experience when we become adults. In other words, he created an experiment that I think is really relevant for a group of smart, motivated students at a highly demanding school. Here's Meyer. If you experience adversity, something pretty potent that you overcome on your own during youth, you develop a different way of dealing with adversity later on. It's important that the adversity be pretty potent because your brain areas really have to wire together in some fashion, and that doesn't happen with just minor inconveniences. And you can't talk to someone into believing them they can master the challenges. Just telling someone they can overcome adversity isn't enough. For that rewiring to happen, you have to experience mastery at the same time as adversity. Now, I could argue that that may be the single most important paragraph you encounter this semester. Do the passage analysis. The tone, if you noticed, is really measured. It's informal. It's aimed not at a scientific colleague, but at people like you and me. But it's hard not to pick up the optimism in it. The big idea is in the first sentence. If you experience a stress at a place like Taft and you manage it successfully, for the rest of your life you will deal with adversity better. But he adds this, that there's a direct causality, but it has to be potent. Look at that phrasing. The adversity has to be real. He says it has to be pretty potent as opposed to merely a minor inconvenience. It's got to be serious. And anticipating a question that you might ask, which is, yeah, well, what if I'm given a really good pep talk? Like this itself might be argued as a pep talk. He says that's not enough. For the brain circuitry to develop as it did with those resilient rats, you actually have to experience the mastery and adversity at the same time. And if you do, you'll become a really resilient grown-up. Now, he's a researcher. He's about data. He's about really probing deeply into the information. But it's hard to miss how empowering that conclusion is, how uplifting it really is. Now, to be clear, Meyer and Duckworth, they're keenly aware that intense and unyielding stress or adversity without control is debilitating. They are not naive to that. Think of the desperately impoverished boy. Think of a girl in a totally dysfunctional family. Think even of being a Taft student at the moment where you are overwhelmed. They are not arguing that extreme pain is a good thing, but they are making a claim that you should listen to really carefully. That research tells us that if you can manage adversity, if you can develop the skill set, the practice, and the habits to handle stress now, you're going to be particularly prepared later. It's a really empowering body of research. It gives purpose to the stress that you can feel at Taft. It isn't something that's just inflicted upon you. It gives real purpose to it. It's as if we've been told that handling stress is a little bit like lifting weights. If the amount is challenging but not excessive, and if you develop good techniques, we can get stronger. I like it because it gives science behind the common sense, science behind what our grandparents have told us, or parents or advisors, but most of all, it points to a truth for all of us. There's nothing in the research that says anyone is disqualified. It doesn't matter how smart you test, or whether you're a boy or a girl, or what your race or socioeconomic class or sexuality or nationality is. It doesn't matter according to the research. Every one of us can become more resilient adults if we successfully manage stress when we're teenagers. And that's what the rats showed us. Now, if you have any doubt about that argument, and by the way, you can find a TED Talk on this exact topic. If you have any doubt about it, you might think of a work done by a really important psychologist named Martin Seligman and his book, Learned Optimism. It's a really interesting read. And it's about a study, and makes reference to a study that he did with life insurance salesmen. Selling life insurance is a tough job. It's pretty much accepted that 9 out of 10 prospects are going to blow you off. And so a lot of salesmen quit, get discouraged, and just give up. And what this means is that big companies, in this case in the study, a company like MetLife, used to see tons of turnover. For years, in order to try to hire well, they gave a test called the Career Profile Test to all job applicants. And it focused, not surprisingly, on aptitude and motivation. And to try to determine who would be a good salesman and who to hire, they only hired from the top. So they'd give this test to people who tested aptitude and motivation, and they only hired from the very top. The problem was twofold. First, they had a lot of unfilled positions because many people didn't test at the top, so they just weren't going to hire them. But worse, even when they hired from the top, the test proved to be a lousy predictor for success. A lot of people still tried the work and gave up, including people who had tested at the very top. A lot of people simply stopped after 1 year. In 1982, when Seligman interviewed the then CEO of the company, John Creedon, Creedon said this: "It's an unusual person who can stick with it. Every year we hire about 5,000 new agents. We test them, we screen them, we interview them, we give them extensive training. But half of them quit in the first year. By the end of the fourth year, 80% are gone. So we lose a lot of money." Now, it's hard to run a business under those conditions, when the stress and the defeats of the job lead to so much of the labor force giving up, and when you can't seem to discover or predict what kind of person is going to be successful. And now, what Dr. Seligman explained next probably changed the course of MetLife. Here's what he said, and it may sound like common sense, but it doesn't make it less true. A lot of studies, he said, show that people who are simply fundamentally optimistic are the most persistent. They are the most immune to the learned helplessness where you feel you can't do anything to make things better. And come to think of it, it sounds as if he's describing those rats. Maybe, he suggested to Creedon, maybe MetLife wasn't hiring the right people. Maybe they needed a test that looked for something more than how smart you were or how motivated you were. What MetLife needed to do, he said, was hire for optimism. Now, you tell that to a big company, it's not simple, and they're going to ask for proof. So they used what was called an ASQ, which is an attribution style questionnaire. Some psych students will recognize it. The ASQ that Seligman used is a pretty good instrument in gauging a really simple thing. How optimistic are you? The first year, they gave it to about 100 salespeople in the firm, and the results were really clear. The agents who scored in the most optimistic half of the ASQ had sold 37% more than the agents who scored in the pessimistic half. Agents in the top 10% sold 88% more than the pessimistic 10th. That's a staggering difference in terms of these studies. And most tellingly, agents who scored in the less optimistic half were twice as likely to quit as the optimistic half. The results enough to get MetLife's attention, and they got really interested. They asked for a study to be repeated. They did it with over 15,000 applicants over the next few years, and even controlling for multiple factors, the results kept pointing to the same thing over and over again. Optimism predicted who thrived, and the results were stunning. Now, you won't be surprised, and MetLife changed their hiring practices. Within a few years, by 1987, they had made all applicants take the ASQ. They only hired from the top half of that, no matter how well they tested in the other areas. The employee that they used to hire who gave up after the year and cost the company a lot of money, he or she was not hired. And MetLife's market share exploded. Now, there's nobody that I know of who's thought more and studied more robustly in the field about how optimism is a huge factor in determining how successful and how happy we are than Martin Seligman. And in his book, by the same title, Learned Optimism, this is what he writes. The defining characteristics of pessimists is that they believe bad events will last a long time and undermine everything they do and are their own fault. Optimists, on the other hand, when confronted by the hard knocks of the world, they think about misfortune in the opposite way. They tend to believe that defeat is just a temporary setback, that its causes are confined to this one case, and optimists believe that it's not their fault, that circumstances, bad luck, other people brought it about. These people are not fazed by defeat. Confronted by a bad situation, they perceive it as a challenge and they try harder. It's hard to imagine a description more apt for all that you have to face. And what I like is that the research, just like Myers, says this can be true of anybody. Anybody can be optimistic. And so you can see where this is going. Obviously, I think of not just going to exams, in particular the upper schoolers, but really all of us at all moments at Taft. How do you manage, in general, the stress of Taft? You've got several highly respected researchers through deep and validated studies tell us two things. First, that overcoming potent stress when you are young, at precisely your age, can make us much more resilient when we're older. And so that gives purpose to the stress we face. And secondly, simply being optimistic can make a big difference. All right, so Taft is stressful. That's not news to you. We have no intention in making this school stress-free, nor should we want it to be. That would be failing you learning the opportunities that those three researchers would want. I know that sounds harsh, but it's not. There's nothing inherently bad in stress. To be clear, excessive stress and unmanaged and unyielding stress is bad for you. There's studies that confirm that high levels of stress that can't be managed is bad for you physically, psychologically, emotionally. This we know as faculty. We're keenly aware of it. It's probably like at some point in your life here, some teacher, maybe your advisor or someone has asked you, talk me through your stress level. Help me understand where your stress level is. Let me see what I can do to help you. But stress can also enhance motivation. It can increase focus. It can drive performance. It can sharpen physical functioning. You all know this. It's the feeling that we have when there's a big exam or the curtain's about to go up or there's an important game or perhaps you're going into a college interview. It can actually improve and sharpen performance. You can think of stress in a couple metaphors that may be familiar. Some people like to think of stress as like the guitar or violin string. That is, if it's loose, if there's no tension at all, it's incapable of making any noise. It can't vibrate, it just sort of flaps around. If it is tuned just with the right amount of tension, and every stringed instrument performer knows this, if it's given just the right amount of tension, it can make beautiful noise. But of course, if it's wound too tight, right, if that string is pulled too tight, it will snap, break. The metaphor I like that I use more often is the one of the tachometer, which of course is the dial in your car that tells you how fast your engine is rotating. And obviously it measures in RPMs, revolutions per minute. And you know, if you go into the car, you've seen it. It's the gauge with the needle. And what it says is, if your idle is at about 1,000 RPMs, for an engine that's actually pretty slow. The engine is under no stress, and you're going to barely be able to get out of the driveway. Now, if that dial goes up to about 3,000 RPMs, now you're really moving, and you can climb any hill you face. But if the dial gets up to about 5,000 RPMs, and of course, this is where it's on the gauge, it's painted in red, and hence the phrase, in the red zone, that's where the engine blows up, right? That's where the engine rotates so fast that it burns out. That's a metaphor I use a lot with advisees, and I often have done this, and I encourage you to do it explicitly with yourself. I'll have an advisee come in who feels a level of stress, and we draw that, pull out a piece of paper and we draw that gauge, and I say, what's your optimum stress level? What's the level at which you feel you really perform happily and successfully? And then I say, where is that dial right now? And sometimes it's getting close to the red zone, and we talk about ways in which we can pull it back. Sometimes just talking about it actually makes it manageable. I think it's an exercise really worth doing. So you might think of stress in those two ways. So let's pull it together with some concrete advice. Let me give some thoughts on handling the stress. And none of this is magical, all right? None of this is new. First is this. Realize that your ability to handle stress is not fixed. This is not a you either have it or you don't. Managing stress is a skill. It's one that can be developed. It's one that I hope you develop here. I was meeting with the monitors last week, and I said, rhetorically almost, I said, how many of you feel that your ability to handle stress, your techniques and skills have deepened and improved over your years here? And every hand shot up. Every one of them said, my skill set and my ability to manage stress is much higher than it used to be. Second, realize that when you experience stress, there's so many things you can do to manage it and to prove to yourself that you're not helpless. By the way, a couple things that don't handle stress. One that does not help is simply repeating over and over again to absolutely anyone else who will listen, I'm so stressed. Right? It doesn't do anything. It's a waste of time. It's also annoying, and psychologists have a term for it. It's called secondhand stress. It actually raises the stress level of others. This is not to say that a thoughtful conversation with someone isn't helpful. That's critically helpful. But you know that person I'm talking about. That doesn't help. Secondly, here's another one, if I can editorialize, and I wasn't going to comment on this till I was thinking about it this morning. Certainly, in the long term, using drugs and alcohol doesn't work, right? There's a reason people use drugs and alcohol, whatever age, teenagers, adults, that you might feel a short-term benefit. To put it bluntly, if you're stoned, you're not thinking about the test you have. But the long-term benefits or long-term harm is really very significant. The fact is there's plenty of data that tells us it's going to hurt your short-term memory, hurt your performance. This you know, you've heard many times. I also think that the stress that comes with trying to hide an activity, the exhaustion of the planning, the deception that comes, of course, when you use on a campus like this or around your parents, that clearly offsets the short-term gains. And so I would say this, by the way, if that is a way that you find that you do cope with stress, I understand it, but I would really want you to find a healthier way, and I would encourage you to actively embrace that challenge. I guess I'm thinking a little bit of Heron's comments as well. That if one of the ways you handle the stress of a place like this and stress of being a teenager today is that you use, I would embrace it. And I would applaud you, and I would encourage you, and I'd be incredibly proud if you were able to sit down with someone you trusted and said, look, I'm really struggling with stress. And one of the ways I do that is I need some help because I want to find some healthier ways because I don't want to get kicked out. I don't want to get in trouble. You can do that, by the way, without getting in trouble. You can do it with me. You can do it with your advisor, counselor, dean, anybody you'd like. So if you ever feel that, remember that. That is an avenue for you. So what else can you do? Here's the first one. Talk to someone who's got good perspective and counsel. Sometimes the simple act of identifying the source of your stress with someone can be really calming. It might help you see the stress in a new light. It might actually make you feel less overwhelmed. It can make some big things seem smaller. It can be a really good exercise to sit down with someone, your advisor, another teacher, whomever, say, I am really stressing right now. I need to talk it through so I can get a better handle on things. Second, this. Know your own signs. Know your own signals for when stress is becoming heavy. We all experience stress in different ways. Do you feel irritable? Do you feel sick to your stomach? Do you have trouble sleeping? Do you lose your appetite? Do you withdraw from social contact? Know your signals and ask that question of yourself explicitly. What are my signals that tell me that I'm feeling excessively stressed? One signal I have is I have trouble sleeping. Probably some of you do that. You go to bed and you're stressed because you're thinking about things and you have trouble sleeping. Another is when my wife says, "Are you okay? You seem really irritable," right? That's a pretty good sign that I need to find a way to manage my stress. Another question. Be active and thoughtful in prioritizing your stressors. If you let the demands, all the demands, be of equal importance, that's really easy to feel overwhelmed. Don't do that. Identify some things as more important than others. Some people make lists. My guess is if I said put up your hand if you make a list, a lot of you would. If you make lists, it helps you realize that some things are more important than others. And even the act of doing that, of placing some things lower down, can help. Some people are really good at ordering tasks over time. And they're really good at saying, I'm going to stress about the test tomorrow, but not the one I have the next day or next week. Simple as it sounds, that simple act of prioritizing can give a sense of control that I think that Meyer is talking about. Another thing, practice very self-aware time management. I know a lot of students who've learned that using a planner of any kind can help them feel more control, less stressed, to feel more agency about what needs to be done. I know students who block out the week of exams very carefully on a piece of paper, or I know people who use Post-it reminders, who color code, who highlight their days. It sounds simple, it might even sound silly, but it can really help you realize that you can manage your demands and manage your time really well. Another piece of advice, practice looking at really big and seemingly unmanageable tasks is actually comprised of smaller pieces. If I said to you, go move that pallet of bricks, you couldn't do it. But if you moved one brick at a time, you could. Your history exam, for instance, might feel overwhelming. I know a lot of students have big exams in history, and you don't even know where to start. But I would argue if you broke it into small pieces, it gets manageable. I was talking to a student last week, and he said, I think I'm going to have like 100 items I need to know. And I said, well, if you wait till the day before the exam, you're going to be overwhelmed. That stress that'll be crushing. But what if you put those in note cards? And what if on the way up to the gym you carried 3 of them with you and you learned them? And what if during H block you learned 3 more? And what if before you brushed your teeth you read 3 more? You get the idea. Take the big tasks and break it into smaller pieces. And the last concrete advice, take care of your body. Take care of your mind. It matters hugely. There's a lot of studies. I won't bore you with it. But those skills are vital and simple. To sleep well, eat well, exercise. Older students often talk about over the years they've learned here about how to go to bed early, and if they get a good night's sleep and wake up earlier if they need to do additional work. Many of you talk about how you use a game of squash or jog around campus or a weightlifting session or aerobics or yoga or meditation, all ways to relieve stress. Yes, and some of you have figured out that a really good meal actually makes a difference. You can actually feel it. So take care of your body, in particular over the next 8 or 9 days. None of this is original, none of it's magical, but I've seen students over the years learn those skills, and I know that's why many, when they graduate, say, I feel really prepared for those challenges ahead. So let's close with the conversation. I went up to the gym on Sunday morning to bike. I'd had a long week. I'd been in New York for some meetings and talks, and I think I was feeling some stress, and so I did what I like to do, which is I get good exercise. It helps me sleep and feel better. When I walked in, Izzy Mittag-Lenkum was on the treadmill, and she gave me permission to share this conversation. It was a great conversation. It was just the 2 of us up there at about 10 o'clock. And she's a great girl, and she's like a lot of you in the room. She's smart. She's done really well. She's got a really heavy course load right now. I think she's got 3 APs and honors and Quest. And she's deep in the college process. So for all of you right here, you know what that's like. She's waiting on decisions. And I told her what I was going to talk about on today, and she was nice, and she lied to me and said, that'll be really interesting. And we just were talking and in between my sessions, and I said, by the way, did you go to the skating party, up at the rink? And she said, no, I heard it was really fun, but I've had a little bit of a cold, so I just hung out in my room and I went to bed early. And then we talked some more, and I ended up talking about those 2 studies, the Meyer and Seligman studies, and we chatted between me lifting weights and she on the treadmill and inclining it to make it harder and harder, the 2 of us going back and forth. And then at one point she switched to go to the Stairmaster, and I asked her specifically, I said, Susie, how do you know when you're stressed? And what do you do about it? And she didn't hesitate. There was not a moment of hesitation. She said, how do I know? I make lists. It really helps me prioritize things. I can feel some control. And I know when my stress level is getting too high because I stop making lists. And when I stop making lists, I realize I need to go do a hard workout. It really helps. Well, good for you, I said. And what are you going to do this afternoon? She said, I've got a lot of work to do. I've got this big Quest English course essay I've got to work, but I'm going to be all right. I feel pretty good, and it's a really interesting topic. Now think about what you just heard from a senior, probably in the most stressful month that she's going to know. It's about as good as it gets. She realized her body was a little run down, so she made a decision not to go stand in a cold rink and to get a good night's sleep on a Saturday night. She obviously had made some kind of list, and she had put that Quest essay or that test or whatever it is at the very top, which means she was prioritizing and saying some things are not as important as that. She clearly knew that the task was big and maybe increasing her stress level because she came up to the gym to do that workout, to sweat hard, to work out, to relax. And then she had plenty of optimism. Remember her comment about, I'll be okay, about this big adversity she was facing. So Seligman, Meyer, Duckworth, these great leaders, they would all be nodding. They'd be saying, that's exactly what we're talking about. This is the kind of person, I think it's every one of you in this room, who will be resilient in the face of stressors in the future. That's someone who's experiencing stress at the school. And again, using that phrase, pretty potent stress, and she's managing it, and she's optimistic. She's probably going to be a pretty happy and resilient woman. So I close by saying this is a stressful place. It's supposed to be, like any good school, it is, I think, safely and thoughtfully and carefully designed, with managing stress to be one of the objectives, and I'm okay saying that that's part of what we learn here. I also know that there are times when the stress can feel almost overwhelming here, and I say again and again, reach out to someone, because as faculty we're keenly aware, and I think we can help you develop the habits and skills to feel better and to manage it. I've always believed we learn to handle stress by experiencing it, and what those rats in Meyer's lab and those salesmen at MetLife told us was profoundly liberating and I think empowering. Those studies said that each of you have agency and control and power, every one of us. The results said you're not helpless, you can learn to manage, there are techniques you can use, and being optimistic will make a big difference. And that's really good news for every one of you. It's good news for you as you enter this last week. I wish you nothing but the best, and I wish you best of luck on the exams, and I won't speak to you before our holidays, and I wish you a restful and happy holiday. Many thanks.